We have the fantastic Madhu, who's going to take us back to the worlds of rocks, I suspect. But again, coming at this from a slightly different angle. You see, there's a theme here. Everybody comes at this world of collaboration from a different background, bringing that diversity of thought to the table. Madhu, if you have any slides, now is a good opportunity to start clicking them. Um, and Madhu, as you will see here, is speaking to us from the other end of the country. So down, I suspect you're down in Cornwall at the
Yep.
moment. There we go. Excellent. But you're part of a collaboration that involves universities from across the world. But without further ado, please put your hands together for the fantastic Madhu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Can everyone hear me all right? Perfect. Um, so as Sarah mentioned at the start of this session, I have been lurking all through this conference, and I've been able to listen to different presentations. And when I first started my PhD, this was one of the first conferences I got to attend. And it was like this 101 into the world of geology and ways of thinking about it. So it's quite lovely to come back to this space, but also listening to all the other speakers on collaboration here, I was just getting in some of the themes around the what of collaboration, collaborating between the global north and global south, upstream and downstream in supply chains, between the social and natural sciences, and so on and so forth. But also the sort of the hows of collaboration, the ingredients like great trust and curiosity, and being able to step back and listen. My talk is going to be slightly different because the question here is what is missing from collaboration right now? Um, we are seeing so much collaboration to a point where there is, in some spheres, collaboration fatigue. And what if we put all the collaborations that's happening in the world right now, what is the additive impact of that? And kind of bringing in a systems perspective. And I think the big question for me is why are we seeing so much collaboration, but there is still a sense that the needle is not being fully shifted amidst some of our great global sustainability crises. So before I properly start, let me introduce myself. I'm Madhu. I'm, as Sarah meant, between two universities, University of Queensland and Exeter at the Camborne School of Mines, which is where I'm currently based now. I'm Singaporean, and I have 10 years of sustainability background at an organization called Forum for the Future, where I was working in our Southeast Asia office. And a lot of my experience and expertise was in building sustainability at the heart of business strategy rather than as corporate social responsibility, as well as in building multi-stakeholder collaboration. And this is what I was doing professionally for a long time. But then I took a step back and started learning about resource crises and inequalities and started working a lot towards land justice, specifically looking at sand in Southeast Asia, because my country, Singapore, is the world's largest importer of sand. And I'll tell you more about sand as an example in thinking about collaboration. And all of that somehow, starting from political science, moving into sustainability, and then sociology, got me into the world of geology. And that's been quite an interesting move. But I think the main thing to bring in is I am all of these things. And if I had to distill this into why this is interesting or important in thinking about collaboration, I will talk about one thing, which is I think what I am is a social earth scientist. And there is something here which is about not just the social sciences. We've talked a lot about the differences between natural science and social science. And the thing here is about actually there is something unique as someone who's coming in from an outside in perspective of the world of mining and geology. There is something about the social sciences that's critical. People have said it. But at the same time, if that experience of building relationship is not anchored in the realities of the geology, as I think Kyle on Tuesday talked about it, the immovable objects or the controlling factor, then actually there is something that's quite not very robust in that collaboration. So that is the thing here is there is something about a hybridization of these disciplines that feels necessary here. And I'll explore a little bit about that over the next 10 minutes or so. So my slide's not moving. Okay. Um, the main thing, oh, now it's moving too quickly. Okay, here we go. The main thing is we're all different, looking at an elephant from different points of view. So if I'm standing in front of an elephant, I go, well, I think that's a sphere, but actually it's the nose of the elephant. So there is something that within where we sit in the system, we have different vantage points. And there is something about if we want to think and work as a system, there is actually value. There is no one person who can see the full elephant. If anyone says that, they are lying. But if we work together, we're able to piece together and understand that actually what we're looking at is not a sphere or a tree, but we're actually looking at an elephant. And there is something here of being able to see that elephant requires stakeholder engagement and robust engagement. And sometimes, particularly having been in the world of mining for the last year or so, I see a lot of talk around so stakeholder engagement as a form of social license to operate. But I don't think that's what it is. I think that that is not the outcome. The outcome is to build and unlock completely different future possibilities because we are in a sector that is a bit broken. Actually, we can say that about many sectors, but specifically with extractive industries, there is something about we need to rethink certain things, and our stakeholders can really help us with that. And I'm going to unpack this. All of that sounds a bit abstract and quite out there. I'm going to unpack this with my story and what I'm closest to, which is sand and ore sand, and why I think systemic action and meaningful stakeholder engagement matters there. So what is sand? Sand is one of the world's most extracted materials in the world. It's the most extracted solid aggregate material because it goes into, as Ewan talked about, with aggregates and concrete, but it also goes into various other supply chains. It goes into glass, it goes into ceramics, it goes into the silicon chips that go into our phones. So pretty much everything we touch in the urban and some parts of the rural world has sand in it. Most of us just don't think about it. And the reality of it, especially from my perspective, is the reason why its impacts of extraction is so big is that we often extract it within industry as a commodity, but what it really is a life world. Its extraction has quite deleterious impacts when it comes to the ecosystems, the hydrological functions, a lot of dredging in certain parts of the Mekong in a Southeast Asian river system can completely flood some parts of the system and then create droughts in other parts of the system. And at the same time, it can also create like destabilize riverbanks and ocean areas such that people are massively displaced. The reality is because it's not visible, a lot of people don't think about it, and a lot of these very in situ impacts get deprioritized or seen as too far away, out of sight, out of mind. And because it's a newer topic, a lot of people don't understand, we don't even understand the causal linkages of these impacts fully yet. So there is something about that which makes it really interesting to study and understand and build kind of collaboration around because we have a lot of imperfect information. But at the same time, as someone who's worked in sustainability for over a decade now, um, I'm thinking about sand within the much wider context of our climate crisis. We are at a particular time where the decisions we make about the world will have dire consequences of what kind of future we will experience. And sand sits quite squarely within it just by the sheer virtue of its current extraction. But if you see the sort of second diagram here, there is something quite big about if we look at the future demand for for materials as a whole. Sand, gravel, and crushed rock are a really big part of that. And you see that the huge big blue band of demand increase over the next 30 years that's expected, a lot of that sits within sand and mineral resources. So then there's a question of we are in a critical window of time with a really big problem, and we can't afford to have incremental or piecemeal innovations because there is something quite big at stake here. And within the futures, the world of futures that I've operated in, there is this big question. We have no visibility in data. We have a very serious challenge. And then the problem is only going to get worse as we demand more and more materials. How do we act amongst all of this uncertainty? And the sort of futures kind of talk that we have is that actually, if everything was certain, the action would be quite straightforward. We will know exactly what we need to do. But when there is uncertainty, there is the need to navigate. And because we are all at the different parts of the elephant, we are all navigating based on imperfect or very specific forms of information. And I think there's something about the sand problem within the climate and biodiversity and all wider sustainability crises we are having, in that we need to navigate together, and collaboration is critical here, because if not, we can't afford that. So kind of thinking about this big problem and then thinking about what is commensurate action here. We have lots of tiny different forms of research and innovation. What is actually going to shift the needle? And there is a question. We don't have a question, but my project looks specifically at one material, which is considered to be a potential technical alternative, and not a substitute. And that is ore sand. So ore sand, you're looking at the middle river sand, which is where a lot of the extractive impacts lie. And a lot of countries are moving towards manufactured sand, which is crushing rock. So even though you don't have the same ecological impacts, you're still crushing rock, and you're creating quite a lot of mechanical additional impacts and the carbon emissions of it. And ore sand is basically a material that is about a co-product from metal mining. We're here in Cornwall with Cornish Lithium, studying their processes to then understand what is ore sand co-production from lithium. But you can do it with many other forms of materials as well. And the kind of key thing here is that this is a material that is not necessarily recovering waste, but actually stopping the production of waste in the first place by rethinking about what is valuable from the beginning. And the kind of commensurate element here is in terms of the quantity, in that if we are taking things from the natural environment in terms of oceans and rivers, there is an opportunity here instead that there is this massive amount of material that's being created into tailings. And is there a possibility that instead of having tailings that fail with create huge issues, is there a possibility of reducing that while also creating a sand resource from what can be quite meaningful as a material? And this started as a collaborative project in the first place, in that one of my hosts, my other institution, the University of Queensland, has been working with Vale to co-produce ore sand from iron ore in Brazil. And now the question is, they've made a proof of concept for one host lithology, which is iron ore. And if we can move this towards lithium and copper and other materials that are critical for our energy transition, is there a sort of not killing two birds in one stone, but actually planting two seeds at the same time? So there is something about that as there's a possibility there. My project here is actually going, this is already potentially quite meaningful as a technical innovation, but we know that every technical innovation that is put in with the best intent and best hopes can reproduce lots of existing sustainability challenges, particularly in the social arena. So the question for me is, there is an opportunity for something here that could be quite big. How can we embed it in a way that's sustainable, or thinking holistically about sustainability from the beginning? So thinking about it from the context of Cornwall right now, having done some stakeholder engagements, it's interesting. There are lots of interesting enablers already present, in that tailing storage is expensive, tailings fail. There is increasing scrutiny around sand resources. There is a shift towards new ways of thinking about sand. But at the same time, despite the global discourse and global sort of opportunities opening up, we're also seeing some big barriers at a local level. And we know that for something like sand, even though it's a global challenge, the efficacy of the intervention depends on the local mineralogical context, on whether something can work. And we have some critical barriers here in Cornwall that are not just related to the material, but also in terms of questions about safety standards, something that Owen talked about in terms of pyrite, but also like questions like, might there be the concerns around that? But also in terms of things like there is not much specification of financing for secondary raw materials, things like questions of, are there primary material lobbies blocking innovation around circularity? and also lots of competitiveness. If we bring in this material, are we out competing local markets and other quarries? And does that mean that we're creating livelihood challenges for other actors? So there is something about working within the market that creates, we realize that we are quite stuck. If we want to work within the current paradigm, the paradigm is actually the power dynamic is we want to reinforce the existing structure, and it's very hard to move. So what if we move outside the market towards how the community is thinking about it and what kinds of questions they bring? We know that from a Cornish context, as a mining place, there are lots of significant environmental legacies in Cornwall. So there is something about if you introduce a new material or a material that the community is not familiar with, are you reproducing some of those environmental legacies, or are we doing something to be able to tackle legacy issues like acid mine drainage, or other things? So that's one question about for ORSAN to be a systemic intervention, it needs to do these things. The other thing is who gets to have a say of how this land is used? Is it just these companies? And of course, for a place where we know that lots of places with great resources suffer from the resource curse in that they don't get the benefits of the resource extraction. It goes downstream in the value chain. So there is a question of, well, who gets to see the distribution of these resources and how does the community co-benefit from it? Again, a criterion for how we design this intervention for it to be meaningful. And again, and one last thing, which is around, is this a rich person's technology? Does this only work in global north countries when actually this is a massive systemic global challenge and we need something like this to work across contexts? It needs to be affordable. And does this outprice countries that are in the current sand market but can't afford to go into an alternative? So to me, being able to think about the market is critical because that's where practical intervention happens. And then the community and its concerns are even more critical in terms of making any intervention resilient. And I think this is where ecological and social justice are not just outcomes to prevent or to attain social license to operate, but actually they are pathway towards a creative mineral co-production paradigm that builds in justice as part of the future that we want. But even then, one of the questions that I often think about and wonder about is what's missing. Even often in collaborative spaces, we tend to silo people into this is an industry person, this is a community person, this person is in the periphery of the power dynamic. But systems change and sometimes systems are stuck. And I do think the current sand system is stuck in different ways. And as systems change, understanding how they change and what kind of leadership roles are needed, not just for the immediate business paradigm or the community concerns, but about unlocking a new future and unlocking a new paradigm can look like is the question. And this is a framework called panarchy, which looks at how systems move and change. And part of it is that all systems evolve. They when you have a very kind of well-known established system, we are conserving that system. It's established. You've got the dynamics works really well, but when it dies, when it begins to not work as well, when it's having cracks at the bottom, it's releasing into a new system. It's like when a vase breaks down, you have little glass pieces, and those glass pieces are being reorganized and reconstituted. Or to Helen's thing of looking at agriculture, when we are looking at a tree that falls, it actually decomposes and mulches to give the soil the compost it needs in order to be able to birth a new forest. So it's the same thing here about systems and systems change of actually where are we in the system so that we can intervene meaningfully to usher in the kind of change that we want to see and work with people's appetites. And the thing about it is, depending on where the system is, there are different kinds of roles that are needed. And for me, there is something about people often get pigeonholed into certain roles because of where they sit. If I'm an industry actor, I'm meant to be the thinking only about my short-term returns and being able to prove my business case. And if I'm a community actor, I get really angry when something bad happens. But how can I contribute to something so that I can see something really meaningful that is not just preventative or kind of retroactive justice. So there is something here about what are the roles needed depending on where in the system we sit. And I think my big question here is very much around if Orsand is about disruption and activating new collaboration, how can that really work and how can that be meaningful? I'll basically close with what I think is commensurate stakeholder engagement given the scale of the challenge. And I think there is something, given the kind of nature of my presentation, something about working with insiders who know how a system works and constructive questioners who are asking meaningful, interesting questions to pick at it and strengthen the thinking. But often where we are stuck at is the activators and the pathfinders who are actually helping us think about entirely new imaginaries. These are usually unusual suspects who are sitting at the periphery of a system or might not even think about something. I worked in the world of NGOs. Mining would have been entirely unthinkable for me at least 3 years ago. So there is something about how do we draw in people who are often not part of that collaboration? What's missing in that collaboration and instilling or kind of building their role up? Or people who already exist in that system but don't see their roles as pathfinders or activators. How do we usher that in? I think is a critical question. I think there is, for a pathfinder, there is something about repatterning the system and rethinking that. For a constructive questioner, there is something about engaging and co-designing towards interventions that are holistic. But critically for the insiders, it's leveraging on their knowledge as well as their expertise within how a current system works, because they have had that for years usually. And in order for all the silos within the knowledge to within each of these groups to be able to talk to each other, this is why we need the facilitators who enable and build the sort of multi-stakeholder collaboration. And again, as I said, there is something here about geology and social sciences that requires some level of syncretization of disciplines, I think, which is quite critical. But yeah, I think that's where I am. Thank you so much for your listening, and keen to hear what you think.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Madhu. And I've been scribbling away, stealing all your diagrams. Don't worry, I will reference you with all of that. And I love where you were finishing there in terms of how do you get those insiders, the constructive questionnaires and the activists and the pathfinders to work together, especially when the activists and the pathfinders don't know that they are activists and pathfinders, and so have to be found. We're going to come to you during the panel session anyway. I'd just like to, well, firstly, give you another round of applause. So thank you very, very much, because that was absolutely fantastic.